All right, Rich, let's do this.
Tell me to swim good. No boat, I float better than he would. No life jacket, I'm at the garden.
Hello. We looking good over there, Ryan? Welcome to Nothing Explained. My name is Sampson, and over the course of this podcast, I will explain absolutely nothing. Aren't you on this one? I think you're on that one.
It looks like I'm right here.
Nuh-uh.
I can see I can see myself in that little thing right there.
Oh, the little window? Because
Yeah.
it's that when it switches, you're not going to be on camera.
Oh well.
Oh,
I'm not sure
man.
it's switching. It looks like it's not going to switch anyway. So,
All right, well.
if it switches, I'll let you know.
We can live with this.
Yeah.
For those of you who are watching, turn off the video and just do the audio. All right, so hey, as usual, everything expressed in this podcast is pretty much opinion, and you know,
It's good opinion though.
it's probably most of it should be well-established fact, but that's not up to me. I don't give medical advice or legal advice or financial advice because advice is a legal term that exists inside of a legal system, and I exist outside of that system.
So you can't give advice legally.
Legally,
Yeah.
yeah. Why you can't give advice because advice is legal.
Oh, okay, gotcha. But you can have an opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And recommendations and things, but it's like literally a word, which is part of what this podcast exists for, because words have meaning, and those meanings change depending on where and what time and inside of what framework you're operating in.
Oh, yes, that is true.
Yeah, so we have to be careful about the words we use depending on the jurisdiction of our actions.
Yes, words are spells, that's why. And I would argue that if you're not careful, then you're not being careful with what you intend with your words, then things will happen that are outside of your realm of experience.
I absolutely agree with that.
And it will fuck with your life.
Has it switched yet? Are you looking over there?
It hasn't switched.
All
I think
right.
we'll just leave it like this.
Let's leave it like this.
Yeah.
So today, I will be covering the Bhopal gas leak disaster.
Ooh, what is that?
So in Bhopal, India, in 1984, there was a massive leak of toxic chemicals from a pesticide plant operated by Union Carbide, a major U.S. corporation.
Yeah.
And it resulted in a massive tragedy, which we'll get into. And it's kind of all a precursor for kind of the general legal framework that exists when you're a company and you do bad things.
Like you blow people up?
Yeah. You know, and like to what extent does that liability exist? What can we expect from that company? To how can we expect them to act?
The companies blow stuff up all the time.
Yeah, it's not uncommon. This is the biggest one that we know about.
Right, right.
And I don't know how long it's going to take me to get through what is basically kind of a recapping of the Wikipedia, because I don't think I have time to get into like what's reported, what versus what may have actually happened.
I want at least a little. Give us at least a little bit of that.
Yeah, that's tough to get into because I kind of just started yesterday of recapping this, and I remember my introduction to this was an audio documentary kind of thing that I heard on probably KGNU out of Boulder a long time ago, and they really emphasized how bad it really was and how much money it really should have taken. And I don't think I don't have any of that like really found. But most people don't even know that this happened. So this might turn into a two-parter where the next one I can get into like some of like what really happened in court, because that's kind of the important thing, you know.
Yeah,
when you think of an entity and it makes a mistake, you expect that entity to step up and be like, "This is a major mistake."
Well, especially if you make an ass load of money.
Yeah,
Like if you've got the money to pay for fixing your mistake, you should pay.
yeah, totally agree.
Yeah.
But that's not how things work. Speaking of legal framework, you can expect the company to assume a position which would expose them to the least amount of liability straight out of the gate. So this is the world's worst industrial disaster. And if you've never heard of the Bhopal gas leak, I would like you to take a time and think about that. This is the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of industrial people, human beings.
Never heard about it.
In modern world, and most people don't even know that this is a thing that happened. So that should hopefully stir some feelings up inside of you, because this is the worst thing ever and you've never heard of it. So
what is it, Sampson?
well, December 2nd, 1984, Union Carbide plant producing pesticides suffered a leak of methyl isocyanate.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Right?
Anything with cyanide at the end of it.
Yeah, and so methyl isocyanate is a precursor, which means they're working towards one chemical, and there are numbers of stages where you take one or two or three chemicals, and you combine them and you get one or two or three chemicals out, and then you combine, other chemicals in there, working away from here are the things I essentially dug up out of the ground or sucked out of the air, all the way to here is the pesticide that I want. And methyl isocyanide is in the middle of a process. So they were making methyl isocyanide and stuffing it into tanks, and then they would later suck it back out of that tank and then mix it with another chemical, and that would, I think at that point, in this particular process, you mixed it with one more thing.
But before the mixing, it leaked.
Yeah. So, and I have this kind of well told out, so I don't want to skip over orders here. So the immediate death toll is listed at 2,259 people.
So there was an explosion. This stuff leaked, and then somehow it caught fire and exploded?
No, it was a plume of gas, and people. We're talking like, and this methyl isocyanate was actually used as a chemical weapon in World War I.
Oh, rough.
So this is the worst case scenario, of like you're burning to death chemically.
That's terrible.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, really bad. And then the government of Madhya Pradesh states a figure of 3,787 deaths.
So are those conflicting figures between what the corporation says and what the
that's like
says, or?
That's basically the immediate death toll is kind of like I think what everyone accepted as what happened like that night.
Right. Everyone else was the people who got poisoned and died later because of it.
Yeah, and then the 3,700 is probably
that's 4,000 people. That's a lot of people.
Well, yeah, and that's so that's the argument between what Union Carbide. I'm sure these numbers were all developed in court as to what we're willing to accept probably happened versus what the other person's willing. So 4,000 deaths is what was accepted as an immediate death toll.
Were those? Do you know if those people were all workers at the plant, or
no? Actually, there wasn't too much death of workers at the plant because we'll get into that. There was 2 emergency broadcast systems, and they'd been decoupled because the state of the plant was in pretty rough shape, and they were having issues a lot. So they'd gotten used to not telling the people of what was going on inside the plant because leaks were kind of common. So, so they basically flipped on the alarm to town and then turned it right back off again. And we'll get into that.
So most of the people who died were in town.
Yeah.
Rough, man.
Yeah. So and everybody most of the worker people. I'm sure there were some deaths, but I didn't find the specifics on that. But most of them knew to head upwind, away from which way the plume was blowing. So, but there is an argument over actual death toll, but basically you'd have to really dig to try and I could probably spend an entire show making the argument about what deaths were, but it's reasonably well accepted, not in legal terms, but you know how that situation is of people being well, it's probably closer to 8,000 people died in the next 2 weeks and another 8,000 people died over the next couple of years.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So a ton of people tens of thousands of people were affected by this.
Oh, injuries were the town was 520,000 people, and estimates of 20,000 people didn't have a side effect. So 500,000 people suffered some sort of side effect.
That's terrible.
And it was 12,000 people were extremely seriously injured.
And the goal of the plant was ultimately just to make pesticides.
Yeah.
Wow, what a waste way to kill people.
Yeah. So, leading up to this, we had quite a few worker injuries due to leaks, including one death. And leaks were so common that their response to leaks was pretty lackluster, which is one of the things that leads up to this disaster. So, in October of that year of 1994, the tank could no longer be pressurized. One hose coming off the tank had a leak in it. And normally what would happen is that they would pressurize it with an inert gas, and then that pressure sitting on top would then push the liquid out.
Yeah.
But without the pressure being able to be sustained in that tank, they couldn't push the liquid out. So they couldn't use the tank anymore. And they had 3 tanks, and the way it was designed was that one of the tanks would be empty in case one of the other tanks needed someplace to go.
Right.
And then the other none of the 3 tanks could be more than 50%. But because this middle tank, 610, the tank that went bad, could no longer be pressurized, they started using the other 2 tanks leaving their backup as a failure. That got thrown out the window. So you have 2 tanks.
So they no longer had an empty tank for a just-in-case scenario.
Yeah. And none of them were supposed to be
That's
over...
negligence.
None of them were supposed to be over... Oh, it just keeps going. None of them were supposed to be over 50%. Most of them, all 3 of them were around 75% full. There's also there'd been a drought, which had drastically reduced the need for pesticide, which is why they had this glut. Like this stuff was stacking up. So I did that 50%, 75% full. Oh, so this is 42. The tank that went wrong. This is 42 metric tons of liquid.
That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, like massive amount of very dangerous chemical. So they halted the production of MIC because they had a ton and they weren't using it very much. And because they're like, well, we're not making it, we can start and do some maintenance. So they shut down the plant's flare tower. So if you needed to off-gas some of this nasty stuff, you'd basically spray it into a flame and you'd burn its toxic ability away, like for the most part. And I don't know the specifics of like how effective that is, but
they turned that off, so they couldn't do that anyway.
yeah. So this is one of the safety systems which is burn it, that got turned off. December 1st, they'd done some stuff and they tried to pressurize the tank again, and it failed. And so this is the day before, and that most of the time, most of the safety systems were not functioning, and most of the lines coming and going were in bad shape. So as part of this maintenance program, they'd also shut down the gas scrubbers. So another way of venting would be to pull all of the non-air things out of the vent, basically. So the only thing you're venting is air. And they had a steam pipe cleaner that would, for like blowing steam in through lines and cleaning stuff out, and that was down as well. So as a portion of this, like they were, they didn't have their steam cleaner working, so they had a guy out there who was basically running water through these lines to clean them out. And they decided that they were going to clean some line nearby, and what you were supposed to do was unbolt this one tank and then put a flange in between it. So, like put a block in the pipe and then run water through it. But they didn't. So the tank wasn't pressurized, which would prevent water to coming in because the water would, that would be pressurizing out. So when the guy put the water in and didn't have the blockage, which was probably poor training, some water went into the methyl isocyanate, and water reacts extremely reactantly with methyl isocyanate. So immediately it starts bubbling and boiling, and temperature and pressure start increasing. Now, this would have, one of the other mitigating factors would have been the refrigeration unit, which is supposed to keep this stuff down around freezing.
Which means it probably doesn't react with the water as much or something like that? Or
yeah, it just slows it way down. So they would have had a lot more time to respond to the issue had the refrigeration unit been working. But since the refrigeration unit wasn't working, all of the alarms about temperature had already been shut off because the temperature of the liquid was already sitting above what the alarm was set at because the refrigeration unit wasn't working. So not only would this have slowed down the reaction, they also would have had alarms that would have gone off to suggest that something was wrong.
Absolutely gross negligence on the company's part.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
What was do you know if the company was like, were they making profit at this time, or were they just totally in the red because of the
this is one of
selling?
40 plants worldwide.
Oh, so they've got plenty of money.
Yeah, and this is also, it's notable that the plant itself was owned 50.1% by Union Carbide. It was operated by Union Carbide. Like that's all the procedures and stuff were being generated by the company, but the ownership of the plant was owned by India and India citizens at 49.9%. So Union Carbide made all the decisions, but some of the profit was staying in the country.
Yeah.
That is the theoretical anyway. So let's see. So some water gets dumped down into the tank. Temperature sensors were disabled. The cooling unit was disabled. And so this pressure started building up and pushing gas out. And then someone notices that they're like, can't, I'm having trouble breathing. There's definitely a leak out here. And so the call goes into the main system, or the guy who's sitting at the console with all the buttons and stuff. And they said, hey, there's a leak. And the guy's like, okay, well, try and find it. But leaks are normal, so they didn't do anything immediately. Like no real action was taken immediately. And so this is about 11 p.m. when it starts boiling up, right?
This is day of now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one leak, this is like in the moment. One leak is found at 11:45 p.m. and by 12:40, which is the end of tea break, they'd had a little discussion about what to do with it, and they basically were like, "Well, keep looking for leaks." But about this time, he checks the temperature, and it's 77 degrees. This is Celsius, so we're nearing boiling water at this point, and which is way off the scale. It doesn't even register at that point, and it's 40 psi when it was normally at 0.
So it's about to explode.
Around this time, an employee notices that these are tanks that are underground and buried in cement, basically, and an employee has noticed that there's a crack in the cement, so this tank is like bubbling, boiling, and bulging. And shortly thereafter, basically at no choice, the tank starts off-gassing. Let's see. And that's by, basically at 55 psi, something breaks, and it eventually just starts shooting this stuff out into the atmosphere. And should be vented through scrubbers, which aren't working. Should have been vented through the fire plume, not working. Should have been mitigated by refrigeration, not working. And the assumption is that in the first hour, 30 metric tons of this methyl isocyanate has been outgassed into the air by the time the alarm is actually sounded at 12:50 a.m. So what happens is they flip the alarm on, and that alarm goes internally to the place and externally to
the town.
Yeah, the town. But as a product of the fact that they were having so many leaks and everything was in such bad shape, they made it so it was possible to shut off the one outside. So the town got a quick beep, we have a leak, and then basically they shut it off, but no big deal. Not to mention it's the middle of the night, so everyone's sleeping. It probably didn't wake anybody up for the most part. And so I think there was a little bit of time before they actually issued the evacuation. But basically, at some point, the cloud got tough to deal with, and evacuation was issued inside the plant. But nothing was done outside. So the police superintendent found out that something was happening around 1 a.m., as reported to him by... I think people subordinates to him, the word had gotten out that something was happening, but no real communication was happening from the plant to any actual authorities in town, and no one had been notified at the hospital or anything at this point. So police receives their first word at 1:25 a.m. and then again they receive another notice at 2:10 a.m., which is that everything is okay. And at 2:10 a.m. is basically the tank is assumed to have been emptied. So it
was emptied into the air.
Into the air, yeah. So at 2:10, there's no problem because there's no more leak because everything is already wrong.
Yeah.
And at 2:15, the alarm is actually turned on to the public and sounded for an extended period of time. But at this point, the town is already pretty much in chaos. So people have been woken up to their symptoms, and they are running and screaming. And like most people are finding out that there's a leak by opening their door to find out why there's people running and screaming, and then toxic terrible. Air is blowing in too. So as usual, worst case scenario, the wind is blowing out, blowing this plume over the nearest population, which is a densely populated shanty town, which is probably there because this plant is put up, which brings in a lot of jobs, which are well-paying, air quotes, and people rush to this town for the prospect of finding a job, but there isn't enough infrastructure to have all these people, so they just kind of throw up their own structure. So one step above tent town, shanty town, and they are the first people hit. So, of course, the first people hit by this whole situation are the poorest people in the area. Mm-hmm. So the main effects of the methyl isocyanate are coughing, severe eye irritation, suffocation, burning of the respiratory tract, stomach pains, and vomiting. Primary causes of death are choking, circulatory collapse, pulmonary edema, which is basically your blood vessels falling apart and inside your lungs. That's a huge deal. Cerebral edema, which is all of your blood vessels in your brain falling apart and your brain swelling. And pulmonary edema, which is your liver being destroyed. And there's a couple other your bowels falling apart, liver falling apart. And all of this is based on the fact that this whole initial reaction started because a guy put water into this tank on accident and it starts the whole thing bubbling and boiling. Right. So if water is the problem, you can imagine a bunch of people walking around who are 80% water. Everything is just going to be terrible. So like, anything that's wet, your mouth, your lungs, your throat, all this stuff basically just starts dissolving. And that's
so raw.
Yeah, it's the worst case. So the first instance that the hospital gets any sort of notification, they're told that it's ammonia. And when treatment did nothing, they pushed for more answers, and then they were told that it was phosgene, which is one of a precursor, or it might be the actual pesticide. I can't remember on that. But anyway, they're told that it's phosgene, which they are somewhat prepared for too. But again, treatments aren't doing anything. And, oh no, I've got it written right here. Phosgene is a precursor to organic compounds. So again, it's something toxic that makes other stuff later. And that was also used as a chemical weapon in World War I.
That's rough.
So finally, well after this is, basically the tanks are empty, town's in total chaos, the hospital finally gets notification that it's MIC, something they've never heard of.
Have no idea how to treat.
Yeah, and had no idea that it was even there.
Yeah.
So there's no treatment plan, and on top of that, there's no disaster plan. There's nothing like this for the town whatsoever. And there had been one woman, I watched one of the documentaries, and a lot of it was half of it was focusing on this one woman who had worked there and was like, well, we need a disaster plan for all of this stuff.
And they were like,
Yeah, and that never materialized. No one cared, whatever. I'm sure there's so much bureaucracy behind that. But the really awful thing is that the vast majority of this could have been abated and largely avoided had they known that what you should have done is just stay in your house and cover all the holes in your house with wet towels.
Yeah.
Because that gas coming in, it's going to come in contact with that water in the towel and react with the towel rather than the water in your body and react with the water in your body. So, yeah. So essentially you had like a bunch of people like running and sprinting for their life, but that creates heavy breathing. So all those people are going to get knocked out. So you have this like just crazy, crazy situation, but the entire town is coated in a layer of gas, and it takes a couple of hours to like really disperse. And, by the time the sun comes up, there's probably 2,500 people dead minimum. And so that's pretty much like the disaster at its face. So you had a just worst case scenario of like totally dilapidated safety systems with no real infrastructure as far as like disaster planning. And they were, and they were already so used to having leaks and everything that when the real deal happened, there was nothing going on. So literally worst case scenario. And who knows what kind of like, what led up to that.
Right.
To what extent, who's in charge, who knows how bad it was.
And this is the official story. So again, this is like the most toned down story that it could be.
Yeah.
It could have been actually way worse than this.
Yeah. This is the Wikipedia version, which would primarily be the accepted version that came out of the court cases.
Gotcha.
So whatever really happened, that's probably not what was settled upon in court. And but that is essentially how history is written. So, and like I said, like, depending on how this all shakes out and stuff, I would like to do some like serious research into what probably really did happen and how that was whitewashed and some of those things, because this is why I want to talk about this, because most people don't know that this happened.
And it's still happening all the time. I mean, if you just look at how many oil leaks have happened this year, like serious, deadly oil leaks, there's 50, 60 of them. So it's not just that these things are happening, but they can be grossly negligent on the company's part, and they never pay any. Do you know anything about the legal case that followed this, or is it part of what you're going to cover too?
We're about to get into that too.
Cool.
But I mean, that's kind of one of the things. The big thing with the Standing Rock, the pipeline there, the DAPL pipeline is, those things leak constantly.
They're made to leak. They own the companies that clean them up.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason. I mean,
why wouldn't
not to?
Yeah, money.
Yeah, and so when you look at the actual infrastructure, what can be expected from it? You can expect it to leak.
Yeah.
And so that was like kind of the thing about the DAPL was like, you guys, like they're talking about how safe it is and it's not, and the impending media circus that came up around that forced the people building the pipeline into a hurried position because they were trying to get it built before a specific deadline where they would have to come up against another injunction, another inspection kind of thing. And if they could get it done beforehand, basically everything was just, it was too late to really argue in court. And so they were like rushing. And there were, observers, people whose job it was to know like how pipelines are built. And these people are reporting back like, I'm watching these people build this pipeline and it's terrible. They're rushing everything. This is guaranteed to leak. And that's the whole
so
problem.
Fucked up.
Yeah, that's the whole problem is that you get this kind of legal environment where like there is a way out essentially of these kind of situations. And I want to talk about this as a precursor to like the FDA and the EPA and stuff, and like kind of the image that they're presented, but what it is they're probably actually doing. So in the immediate afterfact of the leak, the government of India put together like a council to like go and investigate the leak. And Union Carbide and the CEO, Warren Anderson, showed up pretty quickly with a team of scientists to investigate the leak. And when he arrived, he was immediately arrested and charged with manslaughter. And then he posted bond of $2,200 and immediately left the country, which was based on the urging of India. Like this wasn't like he's like, oh, I'm here to help, and India was like, get the fuck out of here.
Really?
Yeah, and I really want to dig into that because there could be a whole bunch of things that are going on there. He could be showing up to like try and do as good a job of whitewashing, and the Wikipedia entry has one little instance of the government being like, it doesn't really feel to us like Union Carbide has any idea. They don't really want to help. They just want to know what we know. Right. So they can try and like get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, prepare an appropriate legal defense.
Yeah. But anyway, apparently he was told to leave. And he did face charges. They did charge him with gross negligent manslaughter, I believe. You like my...
It's squeaky.
I'm so terrible.
It's okay.
It's not okay. I need to stop. But anyway, so there was no medical infrastructure for this kind of thing. There's one hospital in town, and you're talking about like 170,000 people basically.
How do you have one hospital in a town full of 500,000 people?
Yeah, what's that equivalent to? Is Boulder near that size? They've got two.
I think Boulder's even smaller than that.
Yeah.
But that's still outrageous. It's also India. And
Yeah.
they're, and the United States taking advantage of an area that's particularly poor or bad infrastructure to make a really dangerous thing.
Yeah.
Which is not a unique story.
Not at all. So, I mean, you're talking about a very, very, very poor population, a large percentage of it, especially the people who were who were hit first. So there was mass graves, and many, many of the victims were never, ever even identified. And there was a picture taken of, it's basically just like a baby's face right before they put the last scoop of dirt over it in this mass grave that was the picture of the year, basically.
That's terrible.
Which commemorated that whole thing. But yeah, so and then the hospital was just like, well, we don't really know what to do, and they just started taking pictures of people, and so there's like a huge catalog of dead faces, like most of which have never been identified. So it was pretty wild. But the government did rally reasonably quickly, set up a bunch of mobile hospitals, and legal proceedings started almost immediately. $5 million. There was kind of like a quick court proceeding where they were like, just throw up $5 to $10 million immediately to Union Carbide, basically. Like, just put $5 to $10 million up, and Union Carbide was like, okay, we'll put some money up, but that money does not in any way mean we are guilty.
Yeah.
And if there is some sort of settlement later, that money comes off the top of that settlement, and the Indian government was like, no. So for whatever reason, their legal team thought that somehow would give the other team an advantage, from what I gather. So they denied the initial payment.
So that Union Carbide didn't put up the $5 to $10 million?
No.
Wow.
But they offered it.
Yeah.
It was like recommended, they offered, and the Indian government was like, we're not taking that. So put your checkbook away. I think they were like, we'd rather fight this out in court. So
yeah, which is fair because it's a terrible disaster. And they wanted to make sure that all the blame was appropriately. But I doubt that's what ended up happening, but we're going to find out. Yeah,
so essentially there was a lot of fighting back and forth, and nearly 4 years later, Union Carbide was like, we'll give you $350 million. We'll put it into a fund which will which will grow over time. And by the time this is all settled, we imagine that 350 will be about 600 million. So they're basically like, we'll give you a $600 million annuity, which like when you win the lottery, it's like, oh, it's a $1 million lottery, but the amount of money that's actually there is like $450,000.
Yeah, but it becomes $1 million by the time.
Yeah, they pay it out. So that's what they were saying. We're offering you a $600 million annuity. So they wanted to pay $350 million. India counters with $3.3 billion. And then it takes 4 years for it to like kind of hammer it out in court. And then what happens in the end is that like all the court stuff gets thrown out and they're like, all right, we're starting from scratch. Figure this out. Just pick a number. And they settle on 450, I believe. Where'd that number go? 4 years later, they settle out of court $470 million. And that was paid pretty quickly.
It's not much.
No. And then but after the money was paid, there was still plenty of court battles, stuff going back and forth. And 1991, the Indian Supreme Court upheld that original decision and said, basically, like, we're just going to call this matter done. We're going to stop listening to any arguments, class action lawsuits, like this is done, but we just want Union Carbide to post up another $17 million specifically to build a hospital. And they did do that. In 2004, so that's 20 years later, not all of the funds had been dispersed, so the Supreme Court is like, that we need to get this over with. Get all that money out. So by 2006, all of the money had been distributed, and that's the official demarcation line of it's no longer okay to sue anybody for anything. So, and in 2010, 7 employees were convicted of death by negligence, and they served 2 years, and they paid $2,100 each. But that's Indian people,
right.
And that's the max in that system. So if you get convicted of anything in India, the most you're ever going to pay is $2,100.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that, and like the big question then is like, what is that worth? You know? And I didn't write it down, but like the average payment out to victims was like $2,100 per death.
That's terrible.
Yeah. Let's see if I can find it real quick.
Is Union Carbide still alive and operating and doing their thing?
They've changed hands and names a couple of times. Dow Chemical actually owns the site. There's kind of a story there.
Of course they do.
And there's a little bit of like, there's still kind of attempted litigation towards Dow Chemical, but there's widow pension. There's some people who are getting monthly income, but we're talking like
a very small amount.
$7 a month.
Terrible. For killing someone.
Yeah.
Yeah, and regardless of if those 7 individuals ended up being negligent and serving 2 years in prison or whatever, that doesn't affect the overall landscape of how these kinds of events are handled and their capacity to occur. Like all the different safety mechanisms that were shut down. Any of these stories that you hear of these great environmental disasters have the same through line. They were cutting corners. They obviously were doing stuff they weren't supposed to do. The markets fell short of what they were expecting, and then a bunch of people died. And how many times has this got to happen for us to finally snap out of it? Like, because we're still in that fight. That stuff still happens every day.
Yeah.
Happens here in Colorado.
Yep.
Yeah, next week, the guest on Illuminati is going to be a lady from some activist groups working on Rocky Flats. And Rocky Flats was supposed to be she'll tell all the numbers next week, so I don't want to get it wrong, but there was some very large number they were supposed to spend on Rocky Flats. And they ended up spending like 1/8 of that. And they were like, oh, it's totally fine, it's cleaned up. And they said, oh, we're going to have the government come in and make sure it's okay. And they created these little pockets where they did Geiger counter tests that were like specific, like lead sealed, so they weren't real tests of the site. But if you go to the Westminster Dog Park, which is close enough that if you have a Geiger counter, it'll go off. And dogs there get cancer and all kinds of things happen. So this is not far away. This isn't just India. You know, this is. I came back from an eco festival where there's this group called Moms. I think it's called Moms. It's Moms Air Force. That's what it's called, and it's just about moms who want clean air. And the Moms Air Force started because there was a community that got poisoned not so far out in northern Colorado, and all of their community members lost their sense of smell and taste. Like, for that to happen, and then they go to them and they say, well, what's going on? We think our community is getting poisoned by your giant chemical plant that moved into this low-income area. They said, oh, well, the FDA hasn't talked to us, so we're going to go on as normal. So moms had to go through all these different proceedings to get the FDA to do a 2-year study, to then 1 year after find out that, yes, they were definitely poisoning everyone. So then the FDA issued them or EPA, sorry, issued them like you have to do these things to keep it safe. For 2 years later to do a check to find out they didn't even do those things. Then they got a 1-year probation period for them still not to do those things. And by that time, a bunch of people had died and kids had gotten brain cancer and stuff. And they just ended up paying out money in a suit. And the craziest thing to me is to think that there's somebody whose job it was to calculate how much it was going to cost to get out in settlement for how many lives and people you had killed and affected. And they still probably profited off of it because they built what it was going to cost them in settlement into their business plan. Like that, I don't think people are evil, but man, if you ever going to make an argument that people were, that has to be near the top of it, right? And for what ultimately is no other reason than money. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine.
Yeah. Globeville is the most polluted zip code in Colorado.
That's right.
And it just got buried under 10 feet of dirt, and they put big industrial buildings on top of it. So who knows what they'll be creating inside those buildings.
The term that's being used these days is environmental racism, which is the concept that like places that are relatively low income or places that have development opportunities for a giant industry come in and pollute the shit out of it. And it further destroys the property value and all the different, potentially wealth-building assets within that community. So the community gets worse, and then they poison the community, and the community, because it got worse because of the destruction of value and whatnot, has no resources to go after those people. So they're prime targets for these predatory capitalistic practices. And it is not news. This has been happening since the dawn of that shit. How do you get people to care about that? Like, what can we do about these kinds of things to prevent them? You have any personal answers?
No, honestly, I think the biggest jump in awareness came from Aaron Brockovich, the movie.
Yeah.
Because that was, chromium-6, I believe, was the chemical there. And that was a rural, poor Texas town that, people were suffering for a long time before they even started to suspect that it was the chemical plant next door. Yeah. And then once they started to suspect it was the chemical plant, there was like 10 or 12 years of like litigation and stuff before any money even started flowing.
That's the most vicious part, is that the system is so slow to react to any of this stuff.
Yeah, and you can't, to me, that seems pretty intentional, wouldn't you think? What purpose would a slow system serve other than to serve the offender? You know what I'm saying? People want to say, it's just negligence, or it's a stupid error. Like, I accidentally made the system really slow to respond to death.
To other things that were just stupid errors.
Yeah, and you can kind of make that argument once or twice.
But not the hundreds of times that happens in a year.
Yeah, there's a story of Dow Chemicals Teflon plant. Like, Teflon was like the most amazing thing you could ever imagine, and it was nonstick pans were brand new, and it was the greatest thing ever. And they had a plant, and I believe it was in Kentucky, and they were basically just dumping the leftovers out the back door, and below them were like hundreds and hundreds of acres of cow pasture owned by like 3 or 4 different guys, and the cows started dying and getting weird birth defects, and like shit went haywire. And again, took quite a few years for them to even get into court before. And if I recall, the settlement in that one was like kind of even-handed. It wasn't even. I wouldn't even call it a slap on the wrist.
So what do you do? How do you you could probably work with organizations that are trying to apply the proper penalties, but based on the way our current legal system works, would you need some special court that just acted really fast on all these things, or what would it take to hold these kind of corporations accountable?
Well, the reason I'm having this conversation is because I want the popular narrative about the EPA as a function of good to fucking go away. It's retarded.
Yeah, it's not doing that much good.
Everyone wants, this is like the classic, I mean, things are so good, Sampson. I can't understand why you keep having these conversations.
They're not. Yeah, terrible things are constantly
They're really
happening,
not. They're really not. Because, like, what people are doing is that they're like, you know, like you're basically shown a picture of a guy with a bullet in his head, and you're told this would be you if the EPA didn't exist.
Yeah,
and
but
you're like, oh my God, thank you for the EPA, because I don't personally want a bullet in my head. So if we didn't have the EPA, I would have a bullet in my head.
Yeah. But there are
that's
people who are affected just like that, regardless of the EPA still existing.
Yeah, and my perfectly good example is the Macondo oil well, which was Deepwater Horizon rig in the Gulf. That was gross negligence, and that's like one of those things, deferred liability, because Schlumberger was technically the people who were doing the stress testing, and you know, you test all your wellheads and stuff, and I forget exactly what the key thing that someone was like, this is going to fail, and he put up warning flags, and they pushed him to the side, and then it did fail, and they tried to hide that he had put that warning flag up as all the media attentions were revolving around it. But what is the cost of dumping hundreds and hundreds of thousands of gallons of not only oil, right? Because like the sludge that's coming out of the earth is still kind of earthy.
Yeah,
you know?
and all the chemicals they use to break it down.
Yeah, so then what they did was they sprayed Corexit on it. And Corexit is like, you know the commercials with Dawn dish liquid, right? Where they squeeze the drop on it and it sprays out, right? Corexit is like amazing Dawn.
Yeah.
And what it does, oil floats on water, and what Corexit does is it breaks the oil down into something that sinks. It doesn't actually...
oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, so they basically just sprayed thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons of this stuff on the oil to make it sink. So not only is the oil not being cleaned up, it's just being sunk to the ground.
And now a new chemical is introduced to the water.
And Corexit is way worse than what was coming out of the ground.
God damn it.
Yeah. And so what is the value of that? Okay, and like I will also add that Corexit is illegal in a lot of places. And one of the main reasons that they used it was because the legislation was impending that was going to stop Corexit from being used anywhere in the world. And the company was saying, we have to get rid of this shit or else we're going to have to pay to like burn it, which is really expensive.
We're going to get rid of all of it.
Yeah, so I mean, like the EPA does work in the aspect of like, hey, you guys have all this shit. And in order to dispose of it correctly, you know, you're going to have to go through this really expensive process of burning and whatever.
As soon as that process is pending, the company is then sort of encouraged to get rid of it as quick as they can.
Yeah, and
way they can, and it's always extra terrible for the environment.
And if you go and dig into that, you see basically like it was kind of a greasy handshake thing of someone being like, we need to like put out the public campaign that we are doing something about this really quickly, and a CEO jumps up and says, I have to get rid of this chemical right away. So I'm just going to start spraying it on there. Yeah. And wheels are greased, and very quickly, like legislation and all this stuff, permission is granted for them to start doing this without any real oversight. You know, so like it is possible for people at that level to get stuff done very quickly. And most of the time it is a terrible idea.
So then the opposite's got to be possible too. It's just that the EPA is not functioning in the way that it could be.
No.
At anywhere near its capacity.
And for me, there's no better proof of that than the idea of like, what is the value of destroying the Gulf of Mexico? You know, like let's say it's 10 years before it's even like remotely back to normal.
Yeah.
So what is 10 years of a destroyed Gulf? We're talking 8% of the world's water is
That's
just
crazy.
in awful, awful shape for 10 years. Like, what is the value of that? And I guarantee you the value of that is greater than the value of ExxonMobil.
Yeah.
Or is that...
It's probably trillions of dollars.
It wasn't Exxon. It was... all I could see is their fucking stupid green and yellow flower. BP.
BP,
Yeah,
BP.
British Petroleum.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the value of destroying a body of water for 10 years? And I guarantee you that
She gets fucking executed for that.
Yeah. And
like you're endangering our species at that point.
Yeah. And so, in my opinion, the EPA would be like, well, the most we could possibly do here is dissolve the company, sell all of their assets, and then, which wouldn't be a terrible idea because, you know, the entire oil industry is like, oh my God, 1/3 of the industry just got dissolved. We're going to buy in at 50 cents on the dollar, and now we're the new kings on the block, right? So like, they shouldn't really oppose that. And, you know, there's a lot of like job changes and stuff, and that would really be really disruptive to that industry for a while.
It would also scare other industries from doing the same shit.
Yeah, and it would do really weird things to the price of oil, and people would have, you know, there'd be weird oil shocks and stuff, and that's the argument against that kind of thing. But what else would you do? Because selling the company does not pay for. It's not physically possible,
and it's not
to clean up. It's literally not physically
it's not
possible.
Gonna fix the problem.
Yeah.
But at the very least, it can have the only thing you could ever do is come down harsh enough with penalties and restrictions. Like if you literally cut the heads off of the people that caused that and of the people that owned that, like short of that, like doing some really severe shit. And that maybe not kill them, but like have a really severe penalty. People are going to keep doing it.
I'm not pro corporate. That's it's God's thing to judge. I'm not going to go out there and kill people, but I will totally take your company and liquidate it and use all of the funds to do whatever I possibly can to make the situation better. Pay for people's medical treatment.
Yeah, exactly.
Put people to college. I don't care.
But nowhere near that is what's actually happening.
But yeah, that company needs to be liquidated immediately. All of that funds needs to be you could just call up all the heads of state and say, hey, we're putting BP on the auction block right now. Write checks right now. That money is going to relief
and
right
everyone
now.
would buy it, yeah.
But instead, you have 5 or 10 years of legal battles,
which just
in which
cost
case
more money.
BP gets a slap on the wrist, $400-500 million or whatever,
which is nothing
is a drop
to them.
in the bucket.
Yeah, that's nothing.
Nothing
to $100 billion company.
Yeah, and that's not abnormal.
No, it's happening every
it's not
day.
The exception to the rule. This is the norm. A slap on the wrist is the norm. It is cheaper to offend. You can go dump stuff in the ocean. It's cheaper to pay a fine than it is to dump the stuff in the manner that is recommended by the EPA.
Yeah. So the penalties have to be super strict.
Yeah.
That's the only answer.
Yeah. And so when you look at the situation, you see that this is very common. You see that the vast majority of penalties and fines and repercussions that are faced to by these industries are, by all accounts, slaps on the wrist. Then we can only conclude that, contrary to what they say, we're looking at what they do. The EPA's job stands to protect industry from
I understand. Yeah, I agree.
A real recourse of bad behavior.
Yeah, I agree. And the real recourse would have to be so severe that it would be obvious that they were doing their job.
Yeah.
And it would scare the hell out of other industries that do that. There's no argument you could present to me that would say that that's not the case. So what are the other mega arguments are that being that severe would cause penalties in the market that were unforeseen? Like you said, weird spikes in the cost of oil and so on and so forth.
You could suddenly have $5 gas, but
so what? I mean, you're killing people, and our planet can't take much more of this shit. Like, I mean, so much of what I've been researching and seeing about how we pollute environmentally is just negligence. Like, even if we continued using oil and continued using fossil fuels and all that shit, but we just weren't such assholes about it, that might help a lot in terms of the degradation of our planet and the destruction of species and things like that. But it doesn't seem like that's the case. So knowing that, Sampson, never to put the omen on us personally, but for somebody who's listening and thinks well, God, what the hell can I do? What would you suggest? Do you think that they're you don't want to? Should they donate to Greenpeace? What can we do about it? Raise awareness?
Yeah, for me, it's just awareness because I'm tired of people arguing that Trump comes in and he's like, oh, the EPA, whatever. He's talking about these places that are oh, we got to get rid of this. Perfectly good example. Trump wants to get out of the Paris Accord, right? And everyone's freaking out. Oh my God, he's anti-climate change and whatever. And I'm like, the Paris Climate Accord, by its own admission, wants to spend $4.6 billion to correct warming by 0.0 or 0.2 degrees, right? 1/10. So it's like a 1/10. It doesn't actually do anything.
It's nowhere near what we need to do.
Yeah, and in the Paris Climate Accord is the EPA in the regard that people say we're not doing anything. Oh, sure we are. Look I'm pointing at the EPA right there. They're doing stuff.
For us to have the kind of if more of us knew about these kinds of incidents, what's Bhopal? Is that what it's called?
BOHAL.
So look that up if you're somebody who's listening.
BHOPAL.
Gotcha. Yeah. If more of us knew about these kinds of instances, then maybe we wouldn't be so fooled by these sort of half-hearted agreements. And there are probably plenty of people who will tell you that at least that's a step in the right direction. But we're sort of past that point now. In the next 10 to 20 years, maybe 30 years, we're going to see such significant changes in our planet that it's going to be a joke that we tried to make such half-hearted change. I mean, it's already happening. We've got record earthquakes and tsunamis and hurricanes all over the world right now. Well, it is an increase from the last 10 years. It's within. You don't think so? What do you think?
No, it's all the same.
Yeah, same shit.
Yeah, I mean, you get ups and downs, but as far as recorded history goes, nothing crazy is happening. Like in the hurricane season, they're like, oh my God, we've never had 3 hurricanes in the Atlantic before. Not true at all. That it was in '89, I believe.
Regardless of where the actual stats are, which I am interested in looking up and learning more about, I do think it's a call to action that we can't, regardless of how, whether it causes natural disasters or not, this is not, the end game of this shit is not pretty. You can't continue to just pollute and be negligent and destroy people's lives and assume that we're going to be fine.
Okay, let's take the other direction, right? Let's say that climate change is directly responsible for an uptick in floods and all this stuff, right? Let's say that's actually happening. What is the most popular, best funded thing to do to correct climate change? Tax it.
Yeah, the carbon tax is a stupid idea.
Yeah, that's not fixing anything.
We would need real systemic change to change any of this stuff on a genuine level.
Yeah.
But that means a lot of personal sacrifice I'm not sure people are ready for.
Yeah, but to me, that is the raising of awareness. It's not okay, you guys. It's not.
Yeah.
Like what we have is not even close to okay. People want to say, "Oh, I can't believe you complain." Everyone wants to talk about how bad it is or like how we're not free. You know, like I would totally 100% tell you that you are not free. Like every time you pick $1 out of your pocket, that's you enslaving yourself. Like, and it is an enslavement of perception. Like, stop thinking that you're free. Stop thinking that this is as good as it gets. Start looking for things that make it better because they are easy to find. The issue is not, does the solution exist? The issue is, do you know about it?
And do we know about it together? Because it's really our power together that can make that change.
Yeah.
If we all were aware of these kinds of things and we were aware of the solutions, we wouldn't, A, be as convinced by the media that our politics are solving these issues or are making genuine steps toward their change, and B, we wouldn't feel like we was so hopeless. I feel like that's the other side of it, is a lot of people see some of this and they think like, well, fuck. That's it. We're gone.
Nothing we can do.
Yeah. So that's the other side of it is we can't. There are things we can do, but we have to do them together.
Yeah, and we are at this stage where I am expecting some pretty crazy upheaval pretty soon, but who knows? But perfectly good example in the local was this guy. I wish I knew his name. You might even know this stuff, but he made a little tiny home village for homeless people.
The one that was right over there.
I don't know where but there's a version 2 now, but that is a direct, because he was like, I'm going to create a tiny home village and I know that it's going to get bulldozed by Denver City Police and all, like the administration, the state will come and squash this because there is no way to get a permit for it. So they're going to come after me.
Yeah.
And I know they're going to do it. And I'm going to set up that whole situation for the publicity. And that is exactly what happened. And using the publicity that came out of that, he created the actual tiny home village, which is a block from my house. And it's like a cool little thing.
Yeah.
So like
awareness does have a lot of power.
Yeah. And that's the whole thing is like, for example, let's say renewable energy. So like it's not happening on a national scale. So how are we going to get renewable energy? Well, you could team up with your neighborhood. Solar's not super expensive. It's still not like a breakthrough technology, but you could team up with your neighborhood to create like a solar situation and tie stuff together. That is possible. It would take quite a bit of money and organization and it would be very difficult.
Well,
but
you could all
do it.
Start with
The important thing to understand is that if you did that with your neighborhood, they would come and kill it. They would come and they would tear the shit off your neighborhood. You can, as an individual, create electricity and you can sell it to the grid, and you're still taxed on it. You get taxed for whatever you generate, right? But if you got together and really started a sense of community, they would squash that 100% right away.
Is there any legal way to do that?
No. Because that's what they'd be like, this isn't legal. They would come and they would squash that. But like that happening, you should prepare for that to happen, and you should have all the publicity and everything already up and running, knowing that that's going to happen. Because that's real change, is showing people, I tried to make a real change and I got squashed.
I feel like the only way to make any difference is to do that. You're right. And now that I think about it, that the big push there was an unused lot or something like that, maybe 3 years ago, right? That gentleman built a bunch, it was like during the snows and all that stuff. He built shelter for homeless people and they came and the police literally burned it down. And that was enough publicity for him to make this small home village, tiny home village. So I do think awareness can have that impact. But you're right. I think we have to use the media machine against them. We have to turn the tide of public awareness. And that alone should be enough pressure for at least some politicians to give way and get the policy passed to make it possible. I think the solar panels are a great example, and I hope that there's more we can do to support communities that don't have that voice and who will never have a chance in hell of garnering that kind of attention because they just live in places where there aren't even news stations,
Yeah.
you know?
And I mean, if you're someone out there who's feeling like motivated, activated to go and do something, there is a chemical spill not far from your house. I promise you. And anyone can go figure it out, find it. There's probably some sort of EPA report you can find that it's been tracked, but it's not being publicized by anyone.
Mm-hmm.
You can publicize it. You can take your $10 and donate it to that disaster.
And if we all worked on our own localized issues around the state or around the country, and we all fought back a little bit on those localized community levels, it would really change the overall landscape of what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think companies would feel less likely they could pollute in that way.
Yeah.
Also, if you're interested in stuff that's happening in Colorado and movements that you can take part in that do make a change, check out Illuminati next week, because we are going to have some folks on talking about Rocky Flats and the radioactive waste going on up there, which is not very far from here.
Yeah, they pumped radioactive waste into the ground, and then they intentionally melted their nuclear reactor down.
Yeah. So they lost in court, arguing that it was not negligence and that it wasn't destroying the environment. And now they're opening a national park up over the land. And the parks and a couple of people from the government are saying you can't even step foot there, you'll die. So it's really weird, and you can learn more about it next week.
Which I think that's a good thing to finish on too, is that like cigarettes don't kill you when you put it to your mouth, but cigarettes do kill you once you've put it to your mouth enough times. And there's this very interesting gray area of exposure. And in terms of like pharmaceutical drugs, that's called the LD50. Like how much do you really need to take to kill you instantly?
Yep.
And as long as you don't kill people instantly, you can pretty much do whatever you want.
It's not a lethal chemical.
Sugar is probably the most dangerous chemical on the planet because everyone's consuming way more than they should, and it's all of the heart disease, all of the
LD50
obesity.
is super low or high or whatever it would be. Right? You can't eat enough sugar to kill you right away.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So I mean that's kind of like the legal framework of like you there is this like, oh hey, and it gets really creepy out there, people, when you really start digging, because you find companies that make profit off of sick people are often investing in chemicals that make people sick, you know. So the money game is raw. So anyway, get informed. I hope that you've learned something, you know. I hope you felt something.
And it doesn't all have to be, you know, heavy when it comes to the way that you support your community. I'm just going to throw a tag out there. The costume ball, which the WeAreDenver is helping to...
It's our next project. So let's get positive.
Produce. Well, the thing about that, too, is that actually all the proceeds from that are going to go to help I'm forgetting the hospital, but it's a children's burn unit. And if you saw the Christina Kennedy episode, she works as a nurse at the burn unit, so she's raising money for various organizations that help children who've got severe burns, chemical or otherwise. So there's other ways to help in your community. You don't just have to go and protest or something like that, however much that may or may not do. You can go and support events of people who are raising money for really cool causes. So go out, find it, check out the costume ball, October 14th, 7 p.m. to midnight. Yeah.
All right, so I think that should do it. I haven't really explained anything. Nothing changed as far as I know.
You did a great job.
Next week, I don't know. We'll see. We're back in podcast land, so I need to start putting out I've got quite a few people interested in being a guest. I just haven't gotten organized. And if I can't get someone lined up for next week, I might just do like a part 2 and just do a list of other disasters worldwide that would just like rock your world, which would be good after we do the Rocky Flats thing, because I know that's a really big deal. So
yeah, I would like to, nationally and locally, I'd like to learn about all the kinds of stuff that's going on.
I had one of my favorite teachers of all, Mr. Predovich, was my biology teacher my sophomore year of high school, and one of his jobs was being a machinist, and he used to make little titanium bolts at Rocky Flats. So I have a personal connection to that place.
Nice. Nice. I know a couple of my friends' dads worked at Rocky Flats, so and worked in the cleanup. So anyway.
All right, well, let's get out of here. This has been Nothing Explained. I'm Sampson, joined by Ryan Fu, host of Illuminati, another podcast on the WeAreDenver podcast network. Big up to Rich in his wonderful, beautiful space, Ghost House Studios. If you're looking for a place to record, there is no better place in Denver. I don't know that, but I'm still willing to guarantee it.
Thank you, guys. Love and peace.
Love and peace, y'all.